what's going on, everybody? It's me again, Golden Blue Dude. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button. This channel is home of at least one college football video every single day. And it's been an entire week battling COVID. I'm feeling a little bit better today, a little bit more like myself. I've not stopped pumping out videos even when I was feeling pretty much like death. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, probably all the way into Tuesday, those were my worst days. Got through it, kept the videos going, starting to feel better, so hopefully you'll start seeing the more energetic Golden Blue Dude. Whenever you don't have a lot of energy, you still have to at least try to fake it and project energy, so hopefully I did that effectively. Now I actually have actual energy, and I'm excited because it's just in time for championship weekend. There's still a lot of things that's going to be decided as far as playoffs, bowls, who wins what conference. Big Saturday, big one. So let's go through it real quick. First, we have the Pac-12 championship. Number 10, Oregon, taking on number 17, Utah. The winner of that game will go on to play in the Rose Bowl. Then we have the ACC championship. Number 15, Pitt, taking on number 16, Wake Forest. The winner of that will go to the Peach Bowl, and of course, they'll be the ACC champs. We also have the AAC championship. Not a Power 5 conference, but it does have playoff implications. Number 21, Houston, taking on number 4, Cincinnati. I do believe if Cincinnati wins this game, that they are in the playoffs. The SEC championship, probably the biggest game of the weekend. Number 1, Georgia, taking on number 3, Alabama. Georgia's in the playoffs no matter what. And if Alabama beats Georgia, they're definitely in the playoffs. But even if they lose to Georgia, they could still make the playoffs. So it really doesn't decide a lot except for the SEC champion, and it could lock Alabama into the playoffs. The Big 12 championship. Number 9, Baylor, taking on number 5, Oklahoma State. If Oklahoma State beats Baylor in this championship game, they will go on to the playoffs, no doubt about it. And of course, they'll be Big 12 champs. And then the Big 10 championship. Number 2, Michigan against number 13, Iowa. If Michigan wins this game, then of course they're in the playoffs for sure. They're a lock. However, if Iowa wins that game, they're going to go on to the Rose Bowl. If Michigan does beat Iowa, not only do they go to the playoffs, but Ohio State will be the one to go to the Rose Bowl to take on the winner of the Pac-12. Let's run through the new playoff rankings real quick. 1, Georgia, 2, Michigan, 3, Alabama, 4, Cincinnati, 5, Oklahoma State, 6, Notre Dame, 7, Ohio State, 8, Ole Miss, 9, Baylor, 10, Oregon, 11, Michigan State, 12, BYU, 13, Iowa, 14, Oklahoma, 15, Pitt, 16, Wake Forest, 17, Utah, 18, NC State, 19, San Diego State, 20, Clemson, 21, Houston, 22, Arkansas, 23, Kentucky, 24, Louisiana, and 25, Texas A&M. Now, what I wanted to do is I wanted to take those 6 championship games, the Power 5 championships, plus the AAC championship, run through some scenarios depending on who wins those championship games and what the top 10 might look like depending on those results. So I came up with 10 different circumstances, 10 different outcomes, and what the top 10 might look like with those outcomes. So first scenario, I'm going to say that Oregon wins the Pac-12, Pitt wins the ACC, Cincinnati wins the AAC, Georgia wins the SEC, Oklahoma State wins the Big 12, and Michigan wins the Big 10. Pretty much the favorite wins all of the games. I think if this happens, it's pretty simple. Number 1 will be Georgia. Number 2 stays the same, Michigan. Number 3, I think Cincinnati gets bumped up to that 3rd spot. And number 4, Oklahoma State. So we'd have Georgia versus Oklahoma State, and then Michigan versus Cincinnati in the playoffs. After that, number 5, Notre Dame. Number 6, Alabama. Number 7, Ohio State. Number 8, Ole Miss. Number 9, Oregon. And number 10, Pitt. Now, of course, this is up to the playoff committee, so that's not guaranteed. That's how the rankings will look. That's just how I think they should look if that were to happen. Now, time for the second scenario. Oregon wins the Pac-12. Wake Forest wins the ACC. Cincinnati wins the AAC. Alabama wins the SEC. Baylor wins the Big 12. And Michigan wins the Big 10. I think if that happens, the number 1 team will be Alabama. Georgia will fall to 2. Michigan falls to 3. Cincinnati stays in the playoffs at number 4. So we'd have Alabama versus Cincinnati, and then Georgia versus Michigan. That would be a bad playoffs, to be honest with you. After that, number 5, Notre Dame, 6, Ohio State, 7, Baylor, 8, Ole Miss, 9, Oregon, and 10, Wake Forest. Time for the third scenario. These should get more interesting as we go along, by the way. For the Pac-12, we're going to say Utah wins the Pac-12, Pitt wins the ACC, Houston wins the AAC, Alabama wins the SEC, Oklahoma State the Big 12, and Michigan the Big 10. If that were to happen, here's how I think it falls into place. Number 1, Alabama. 2, Georgia. 3, Michigan. and 4, Oklahoma State. So we'd have number 1, Alabama versus number 4, Oklahoma State. And number 2, Georgia versus number 3, Michigan. Pretty good playoffs. After that, number 5, Notre Dame. Number 6, Ohio State. Number 7, Ole Miss. Number 8, Cincinnati. Number 9, Michigan State. And number 10, Pitt. Now time for the fourth scenario. Utah wins the Pac-12. Wake Forest wins the ACC. Houston wins the AAC. Georgia wins the SEC. Baylor the Big 12. And Michigan the Big 10. If that were to happen, number 1 would be Georgia. Number 2, Michigan. Number 3, Alabama. And number 4, Notre Dame. Yeah, I think Notre Dame would make the playoffs in that scenario. So you'd have number 1, Georgia against number 4, Notre Dame. And then you'd have the 2 seed Michigan against the 3 seed Alabama for the playoffs. That's not a bad playoffs. After that, number 5, Ohio State. 6, Ole Miss. 7, Baylor. 8, Cincinnati. 9, Michigan State. And 10, Wake Forest. Time for scenario number 5. Utah wins the Pac-12. Wake Forest wins the ACC. Cincinnati wins the AAC. Georgia the SEC, Baylor the Big 12, and Iowa the Big 10. If that were to happen, this one's a little bit more tricky. I have number 1, Georgia, number 2, Cincinnati, number 3, Alabama, number 4, Notre Dame. So it would be Georgia versus Notre Dame, and then Cincinnati versus Alabama in the playoffs. That's a pretty good one as well. After that, Michigan falls down to number 5, then 6, Ohio State, 7, Baylor, 8, Ole Miss, 9, Iowa, and 10, Wake Forest. Scenario number 6. Oregon wins the Pac-12. Pitt wins the ACC. Houston the AAC. Georgia the SEC. Baylor the Big 12. And Iowa the Big 10. Now, that's a bit of chaos on that one. Here's how I think it would turn out. Number 1, Georgia. Number 2, Alabama because of all the other teams losing. Number 3, Notre Dame. Number 4, Baylor. Yes, I do have a scenario where Baylor can still make the playoffs. Total chaos would have to happen, but I'm telling you, if you sit down and look at it, this does make sense. So we'd have the 1 seed Georgia against the 4 seed Baylor, and then the 2 seed Alabama against the 3 seed Notre Dame. After that, number 5, Michigan. Number 6, Ohio State. Number 7, Ole Miss. Number 8, Cincinnati. Number 9, Oregon. And number 10, Pitt. Time for scenario number 7. Oregon wins the Pac-12. Pitt the ACC. Houston the AAC. Alabama wins the SEC. Oklahoma State the Big 12. And Iowa the Big 10. In that scenario, I have number 1, Alabama. Number 2, Georgia. Number 3, Oklahoma State. And number 4, Notre Dame. So we'd have Alabama versus Notre Dame. And then Georgia versus Oklahoma State. That's a pretty good playoffs. After that, number 5, Michigan. Number 6, Ohio State. 7, Ole Miss. 8, Cincinnati. 9, Oregon. And 10, Pitt. Just 3 more scenarios, guys. So here's scenario number 8. Utah wins the Pac-12. Pitt the ACC. Houston the AAC. Alabama the SEC. Baylor the Big 12. And Iowa the Big 10. A little more chaos in that one as well. If that were to happen, number 1, Alabama. Number 2, Georgia. Number 3, Notre Dame. Number 4, Baylor again. So actually 2 scenarios where Baylor can make the top 4. So we'd have number 1, Alabama versus number 4, Baylor. And then number 2, Georgia versus number 3, Notre Dame. Pretty good playoffs. And then after that, number 5, Michigan. 6, Ohio State. 7, Ole Miss. 8, Cincinnati. 9, Pitt. And 10, Iowa. Last 2 scenarios. So this is scenario number 9. Oregon wins the Pac-12. Wake Forest the ACC. Cincinnati the AAC. Georgia the SEC. Oklahoma State the Big 12, and Iowa the Big 10. If that were to happen, have Georgia number 1, Cincinnati number 2, Oklahoma State number 3, and Notre Dame number 4. So we'd have number 1 Georgia taking on number 4 Notre Dame, number 2 Cincinnati taking on number 3 Oklahoma State. That's not a bad playoffs either. After that, number 5 Michigan, 6 Ohio State, 7 Ole Miss, 8 Oregon, 9 Iowa, and 10 Wake Forest. And finally, the last scenario, which by the way, I'm sure there's a million different other scenarios. These are just my top 10 scenarios. Utah wins the Pac-12, Wake Forest the ACC, Cincinnati the AAC, Alabama the SEC, Oklahoma State the Big 12, and Michigan the Big 10. If that were to happen, number 1 Alabama, number 2 Georgia, number 3 Michigan, and number 4 Cincinnati. So we'd have the 1 seed Alabama taking on the 4 seed Cincinnati, and then the 2 seed Georgia taking on the 3 seed Michigan. Pretty good playoffs. After that, number 5, Oklahoma State. Yeah, this is the rare scenario where I think if Oklahoma State wins the Big 12, they don't get into the playoffs. So Oklahoma State actually does need Georgia to beat Alabama just to make sure they eliminate Alabama, because that's the spot for them. Number 6, Notre Dame. Number 7, Ohio State. Number 8, Ole Miss. number 9, Michigan State, and number 10, Wake Forest. Y'all let me know what you think about these scenarios. How likely are they? And how close do you think I would be to being correct about the final rankings if these scenarios were to happen? That's all I got for you for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you on my next show.